Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 332, Operation Barbarossa, Part 2. Last time, we covered the planning stages of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Nazi Germany's army, the Wehrmacht. Hitler was so sure of success that he uttered his famous line regarding the invasion of the USSR, quote, "We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Today, we begin our story on June 21st, 1941. Late that night, Soviet troops were sent NKO Directive Number 1, which called them to be, quote, "bring all forces to combat readiness, but to avoid provocative actions of any kind." As I mentioned in the last episode, a German soldier, Alfred Liskow, crossed the lines at 9 p.m. on the 21st and warned the Soviets that an invasion was imminent. While Stalin did not believe it, his now very nervous commanders in the field did. They kept warning Stalin that the Germans were massing their troops on the borders, to no avail. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched with an aerial bombing of Soviet-controlled cities in Poland. The artillery bombardment began quickly thereafter all along the front. Airstrikes went as far east as Kronstadt near Leningrad and south into Sevastopol in the Crimea. At this point, the declaration of war was presented to the Soviet ambassador. Here is the English translation of the declaration of war by Germany, delivered to the Soviet ambassador in Berlin at 4 a.m. local time and 5 a.m. Moscow time. Presented by Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop to the Soviet ambassador on June 22nd. Quote, "In view of the intolerable threat that arose at the German eastern border as a result of the massive buildup and preparedness of all armed forces of the Red Army, the German government considers itself compelled to immediately take military countermeasures. The corresponding note will be presented to Dekanovic in Berlin at the same time." What's fascinating about this document is that it was hidden by the Soviet authorities from their own people until 1989, despite being released in the West within days of the invasion. In the opening moments of the invasion, calls started to flow into Moscow, prompting Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the chief of staff, to call Stalin at Kuntsevo, which was supposed to be a secret location. Here is what author Simon Sebag Montefiore writes about Zhukov's attempt at informing Stalin of the attack. Stalin had retired when Zhukov called Kuntsevo. Quote, "Who's calling?" the sleepy voice of the NKVD general answered. "Zhukov, chief of staff. Please connect me to Comrade Stalin. It's urgent." "What? Right now? Comrade Stalin's sleeping." "Wake him immediately," Zhukov told the duty officer. "The Germans are bombing our cities," the officer replied. "Comrade Stalin is not here, and I don't know where he is." "I have an exceedingly important message which I must immediately relay to Comrade Stalin. Personally, I can't help you in any way," he replied, and hung up. So Kuznetsov called Timoshenko, who was deluged with calls and afraid to inform Stalin. Kuznetsov tried all the numbers he had for Stalin, but to no avail, so he called the Kremlin again. "I request you to inform Comrade Stalin that German planes are bombing Sevastopol. This is war." "I shall report it to the proper person." A few minutes later, the admiral discovered who the proper person was. Flabby, quiet-spoken Malenkov called, asking in a dissatisfied, irritated voice, "Do you understand what you're reporting?" Stalin's reign of terror had rendered the generals impotent, as they were all petrified of waking him or even informing him of what was happening. Zhukov finally got in touch with him, informing him of the invasion. "Did you understand me?" asked Zhukov. "Comrade Stalin." After a few moments, Stalin replied, "Bring Timoshenko to the Kremlin. Tell Poskrebayesh to report and summon the Politburo." When Zhukov, Timoshenko, Kuznetsov, and Budyonny finally convinced the boss that an invasion was underway, Stalin was unusually delusional about the situation. He kept insisting that Hitler was not behind the attack, claiming that it was probably just some rogue generals. It wasn't until Molotov insisted that this was a full-on invasion that Stalin woke up to the fact that Hitler had indeed ordered the attack. He began to issue a steady stream of orders, with the most important one, in my opinion, being the order for Kaganovich to prepare the trains to move as many factories and people as possible away from the front. The Germans could not obtain any of these resources or the 20 million people needed to operate the factories. Stalin would be involved in an incredible array of orders, some of which would seem utterly ridiculous in hindsight. I mean, this included things like the shape of the bayonets and the number of articles written about General Konev, which he stopped because he thought he would become too popular. At the time, there was no real central headquarters where the military response could be developed. Stalin then created one known as the Stavka. The group that joined Stalin at the Kremlin wanted the boss to make a speech to the people of the Soviet Union, but he declined, instead ordering Molotov to deliver the news. The announcement on June 22nd went as follows, quote, "Our cause is just. The enemy will be crushed. Victory will be ours." When Molotov returned, Stalin supposedly said, quote, "Well, you sounded a bit flustered, but the speech went well." It was then that reports began to arrive at Stavka that the German invasion and the Soviet response was far worse than expected. Things were getting out of hand. As Montefiore put it, quote, "Stalin was absorbing the scale of the catastrophe. The fronts were out of control. The Nazis were approaching Minsk. The Air Force was decimated and 30 divisions shattered." On the 26th, Stalin urgently recalled Zhukov from the southwestern front. The chief of staff found Timoshenko and General Vatutin standing to attention before Stalin, the eyes red from the lack of sleep. Stalin ordered, "Put your heads together and tell me what can be done." He gave them 40 minutes to propose new lines of defense. It was at this very low point in the Soviet war effort that Joseph Stalin looked like a beaten man. As Molotov remembered what his boss said as they headed to Kuntsevo, quote, "Lenin left us a great heritage, and we, his successors, have effed it all up." When they arrived at his dacha, Stalin then said, "We effed it up." Things were so bad, Stalin, for the first time since he took control of the Soviet Union, was scared that he might get caught up in a purge and get arrested and executed. Lavrenti Beria's son Sergo recalled an occasion when 7 Politburo members visited Stalin one day. He told the group that he was receiving a lot of mail rebuking him for the invasion. It made the leader worried. As one member put it, Stalin turned to stone. Fearing for his life, he asked the group, "Why are you here?" It is at this moment that Molotov stepped up and told Stalin, quote, "Thank you for your frankness, but I tell you here and now that if some idiot tried to turn me against you, I'd see him damned. We're asking you to come back to work." Within minutes, Stalin resumed his confident air. They began to assign specific war industries to each of those in attendance. Malenkov was to be in charge of airplanes, Molotov will accelerate the construction of tanks, and Voznesensky would oversee armaments. Now it's time to go over the German side. They had knocked out France in an astonishing month and a half. They were using their Luftwaffe to bomb Great Britain and had taken most of the Low Countries of Western Europe. They could not have been feeling anything less than invincible at this point in time. Their only problem was the Battle of Britain. In the beginning, they seemed to be winning, but as the air battles wore on, it was becoming more and more apparent that they were not going to get Great Britain to surrender anytime soon. The Germans had plans. On July 18th, 1940, Hitler had ordered the preparation of Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of England. Because they couldn't maintain air superiority, they abandoned the idea. This is when Hitler came up with the idea that if they could destroy the Soviet army in the east, then England would have no choice but to sue for terms. In the first month of Operation Barbarossa, Russia had over 2 million men killed or captured, losing 3,500 tanks and 6,000 aircraft. On July 16th, they captured Smolensk, a key gateway to Moscow. However, the tidal wave of victories was beginning to wane as Timoshenko's battalions fought hard to slow down the advance. Hitler then ordered Army Group Center to regroup in late July. Still, the three primary targets for conquest, Moscow, Leningrad, and the Donetsk Basin, were still in Soviet hands. As was Hitler's mindset, whenever things didn't go entirely his way, he changed the goals. This time, he came up with a new plan: go after Moscow and Ukraine. With this change and the increasing number of soldiers surrendering, Stalin responded with a new plan for the Red Army known as NKGB Order Number 246, or as the public would later come to know it, Order Number 270. In it stated that any man who surrendered would forfeit the lives of his entire family. It reads, quote, I order anyone who removes his insignia and surrenders should be regarded as a malicious deserter whose family is to be arrested as a family of a breaker of the oath and betrayer of the motherland. Such deserters are to be shot on the spot. Those falling into an encirclement are to fight to the last. Those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by any means available, while their families are to be deprived of all assistance. Millions of men, women, and children would lose their lives or their standing in their communities. Stalin's own son, Yakov, always seemingly a disappointment to the boss, was captured on July 16th when his group, the 14th Howitzer Regiment of the 14th Armored Division, was overrun. Stalin's response was, quote, the fool. He couldn't even kill himself. With the front moving forward, Kyiv was now in jeopardy of falling into Nazi forces. Chief of Staff Zhukov was one of the opinion that the city could not be held and that a complete evacuation and full retreat should be called for. When asked by Stalin what should be done, Zhukov told him in no uncertain terms. Stalin's reply was, quote, why talk nonsense? Zhukov responded by bravely saying, quote, if you think if the chief of staff talks nonsense, then I request you relieve me of my post and send me to the front. Meklis, who was in the room, snapped, who gave you the right to speak to Comrade Stalin like that? Stalin jumped in and said, don't get heated. Since you mentioned it, we'll get by without you. Zhukov was right, and Stalin knew it. One of the first fronts, or the worst fronts, at the beginning of the war was one we covered in a series a few years ago, Leningrad. Initially, 3 men were leading the defense of the city. Popov, the front commander, Zhdanov, the overall leader, and Voroshilov. None of them were doing a good job. Then again, I don't think anyone could have done much better. Writing to Molotov and Malenko, Stalin had this to say, quote, I fear Leningrad will be lost through imbecilic folly and all Leningrad risk encirclement. What are Popov and Voroshilov doing? They don't even tell us of the measures they're taking against the danger. They're busy looking for new lines of retreat. As far as I can see, this is their only purpose. This is pure peasant fatalism. What people? I can't understand anything. Don't you think someone's opening the road to the Germans in this important direction? On purpose? What's this man Popov? What's Voroshilov doing? How's he helping Leningrad? I write this because I'm disturbed by the lack of activity of Leningrad's commander. Return to Moscow. Don't be late. Stalin. The boss knew that only one person could get the job done in the second most important city in the Soviet Union, and that was Marshal Zhukov. On September 8th, 1941, Stalin summoned Zhukov to his flat in Moscow. Molotov, Malenkov, and Shcherbakov were all in attendance as well. The conversation between Stalin and Zhukov supposedly went like this, according to Montefiore. "Where will you be off to now?" Stalin asked casually. "Well, back to the front," replied Zhukov.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Are you a descendant of America's emancipated slaves, otherwise known as the Freedmen, Foundational Black Americans? Then Freedmen's Affairs Radio is your home for real talk, where history, culture, politics, and economics collide to shape our future. Every Tuesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, we bring unfiltered commentary and deep insight into the Black American experience. Past, present, and future. Come join the conversation. Tap in on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. This is Freedmen's Affairs Radio, where the lineage speaks.
Which front? The one you consider most necessary. Then go to Leningrad at once. The situation is almost hopeless there. He handed Zhukov a note to Voroshilov that read, "Hand over command to Zhukov and fly to Moscow immediately." Stalin scrawled to Zhdanov, "Today, Voroshilov's recalled." In November, Stalin was informed that the Germans were setting up strongholds in the basements of homes on the outskirts of Leningrad. His response, which was delivered to the troops on the front lines, was, quote, "When moving forward, don't try to capture one of other points, but burn to the ashes these populated areas. So the German staffs and units will be buried. Toss away any sentiment and destroy all populated areas you meet on your way." The next front that had Stalin nervous was the one pointed at Moscow. At the time, Averell Harriman from the U.S. and Lord Beaverbrook from the U.K. were in negotiations in Moscow to provide U.S. aid to the Soviet Union. While Stalin bemoaned the aid being offered during the talks, he would admit privately it was one of the turning points in the war effort. By now, though, the Germans were only 100 kilometers away from the Soviet capital. Again, there was only one person Stalin trusted with its defense, Zhukov. He ordered him back to Moscow. With the German panzer divisions rapidly approaching the capital, weather became the next line of defense. Snow began to fall and then thawed, which turned the roads into quagmires of mud. The advance slowed considerably, allowing Zhukov to develop a defense strategy. The weather then continued to get colder, to the point where the German tanks and foot soldiers were beginning to freeze. The German tanks could not operate in this kind of cold, and what the Germans and most of the generals also did not know was that Stalin had carefully hidden vast numbers of reserves. Spies in the Far East had messaged the Kremlin that the Japanese were no longer a threat to invade. Lazar Kaganovich was tasked with returning 400,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes from the region starting on October 12th. It took 7 days to load all the trains heading west. The hidden army was now ready to counterattack and push the Germans back. By early December, counterattacks had begun on 4 fronts. Stalin finally delivered his reserves into Zhukov's hands, and Hitler's blitzkrieg had ground to a halt. The Battle of Moscow would be the first victory claimed by the Red Army since Operation Barbarossa began. In the south, the Germans were making slow advances due to the rough terrain. While Stalin believed that Hitler would make another attempt at capturing Moscow, this was not the case. the Nazi leader was hell-bent on getting to the granaries of Ukraine and the oil in the Caucasus. Stalin wanted to attack the Germans on all fronts, but in reality totally lacked the resources necessary to pull off that size of an operation. Instead, this would lead to the Germans making it all the way to Stalingrad. A significant problem arose that would stop the Nazi advance. Believing that they would just march into the USSR and annihilate their armies easily, their supply lines were pretty thin and undersupplied. This caused a holdup in the advance and stalled the march through the vast landscape of the Soviet Union. This would prove to be a fatal error. Heinz Guderian, Fyodor von Bock, and Franz Halder all believed at this point to make the main strike Moscow. Guderian was sent to Berlin to make an appeal to Hitler, but he was rebuffed and convinced that this was not the correct plan, which he relayed to the others, making them distrust Guderian for the remainder of the invasion. So there's cracks beginning to occur between the different generals within Hitler's army. Moving away from the military focus of Operation Barbarossa, we need to talk about the effect it had on the Soviet citizens as well as the captured soldiers. It is estimated that 2 million soldiers under Nazi incarceration died due to starvation. An estimated 58% of all captured Red Army troops died by the end of the war. As for the civilians, they were treated as though they were lower forms of humanity, known as Untermenschen. German High Command ordered that the Wehrmacht soldiers were to show no mercy to the citizens, and that the war effort, quote, demands ruthless and vigorous measures against Bolshevik inciters, guerrillas, saboteurs, Jews, and the complete elimination of all active and passive resistance. Jews were particularly aimed at, as it is estimated that 1.4 million were slaughtered by SS members and regular army soldiers. Within the Ukraine, Nazi propaganda espoused the message that they were liberators, freeing the people of Bolshevism, providing land reform, and giving the people religious freedom. As we know, all of this was a terrible hoax, as they had no intention of providing any of this to the people. This was to be yet another fatal mistake, as the Ukrainian people would have embraced this. I mean, all the torture and the starvation, the Holodomor that Stalin, inflicted on them, and it wasn't apparent that the Nazis weren't going to deliver these promises, but they didn't. In December 1941, the Soviet Red Army was sufficiently manned to stop the Nazi army on all fronts. On January 7th, 1942, Operation Barbarossa was officially called off. The war was to take a turn for the worse for the Germans. They would lose 837,000 men in this ill-thought-out invasion. From that moment on, savage warfare would continue until early May 1945. Millions would die, and Operation Barbarossa was going to go down in history as a complete and total failure. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Join me next time when we cover a topic suggested by a listener. And this listener, if you could message me on Facebook or in our Facebook group, I want to, acknowledge your suggestion here, because it's something that I didn't know much about. And I asked my theater friends if they ever heard of this man, Konstantin Stanislavski, the Soviet-Russian actor supreme and the man who developed the initial ideas behind method acting. And I want to thank that listener, because I am totally engrossed with this topic, and I'm really looking forward to telling everybody about it in a couple of weeks. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.